In this lecture, we'll be looking at the development of East Asian civilization. So, in this section so far, we've been really looking at China, but it's important to understand that China is part of a region that we often call East Asia, which basically primarily consists of China, Japan, and Korea. And eventually, these three countries would interact with each other. And a lot of that interaction during this time period is Korea, or what will become Korea and what will become Japan, borrowing from China, but also adapting Chinese ideas and institutions and things like that to their own interests while also maintaining political independence. So what's really fascinating is that, China's this gigantic country that keeps getting bigger and bigger. And it's amazing in the sense that Japan, and in particular Korea, since it would eventually share a border with China, would manage to maintain their independence and develop their own unique identities. So we'll be kind of looking at how that happens and how part of that involves borrowing and adapting stuff from China. So we'll start looking at Korea. So what's going to happen is during the Han Dynasty, the Chinese will actually establish colonies in the northern part of Korea in what is today northern Korea or North Korea. And during that time period, people who will eventually become Koreans, they're kind of at a tribal level right now, are going to have interaction with these Chinese people and learn about things like Chinese and Buddhist culture and also about writing, right? They didn't have their own writing system, so they're going to borrow the Chinese writing system. Remember, that's not such a big deal. It's not difficult because, remember, in Chinese, the way you pronounce a character isn't important. It's the shape of the character that's important. So it's relatively easy for Koreans and Japanese to pick that up to learn to write, even if they couldn't speak Chinese. And in a sense, by borrowing these Chinese and Buddhist culture and writing, and as well as things like government structure, Korean kingdoms will be established. Koreans will go from having more of a tribal level organization to a state level of organization. And as the Chinese become weaker, right, remember the Han Dynasty will decline and eventually fall, and then you'll have several hundred years when there's no unified China. That point, Koreans will be able to push those Han Dynasty colonies out of Korea and get rid of Chinese influence on the peninsula. And eventually, what's going to happen is that there will be a united independent Korean kingdom called Shilla, which will be established in the 7th century. So Koreans are able to creatively adopt and borrow from China, but that doesn't mean they become Chinese. They will use what they borrow from China to develop their own states, and when China gets weak, they will actually expand themselves. So they like Chinese cultural influence, but want to maintain Korean political independence. And like I said, this first, in a sense, there's lots of arguments about this actually in Korea, but for our purposes, you've got this unified independent Korean kingdom of Shilla by the 7th century. And as we saw similarly with China, there's also going to be importances of Buddhism, important Buddhist connections here. So, like I said, Korea is politically independent but culturally connected to China and Japan. What does this connection mean? Well, Korea will help spread Buddhism to Japan. So there's this kind of link. Koreans will get Buddhism from India and from China, but then will spread it on to Japan. Korean monks and nuns, in fact, will go to Japan and do things like help build Buddhist temples and teach about Buddhism. In addition, in Korea itself, Buddhism will be a state-sponsored religion for much the same reason why it was in China. Monks are oftentimes very highly educated, very wise people. They can give you good advice. The prayers of monks and nuns are believed to be effective at gaining the power of supernatural beings to help protect the nation. And of course, associating your country with Buddhism is a great way to gain legitimacy. And Koreans really emphasize that. There was a lot of the kingdom of Shilla spent a lot of time building Buddhist temples and things like that in order to unite its people around the religion and the state, right? Basically, there was this idea that our country, our state, has a special relationship with Buddhism, and so you should support the government. You should obey the government because we are connected to Buddhism, and Buddhism is the truth. And the world operates according to Buddhist rules. And you can kind of see this in a temple the Koreans built, or a temple complex. I've been to it. The thing is breathtaking, called Bulguksa, which means Buddha Land Temple. Bul is Korean for Buddha, Guk means country, and Sa means temple. So Bulguksa is Buddha Land Temple, meaning our country of Korea, Shilla Korea in this case, is so connected to Buddhism that living in our country is like living in a Buddhist paradise. And Buddhism's the truth. It's an effective, true, good religion. Our country is governed by Buddhist principles, so you should support the government. So they draw this close kind of connection in this way. And I just want to show you an example of the height that Korean Buddhist art could get to. This is Sokuram Grotto, which is near Bulguksa in southern Korea. And this is a very beautiful Buddha that they built underground. This is like a human-made cave surrounded by being guardian spirits of the zodiac. But you can see this is a very, very advanced form of art. I mean, the sculpture of this stone is really impressive. So we have, again, this advanced culture being developed in Korea, in part thanks to the spread of Buddhism. We will now shift to Japan. So one thing I want to highlight from this map of Japan is that during the period we're talking about, Japan was not unified. There was a very powerful state called the Yamato state, and Yamato is the name of the imperial clan. So you know that today in Japan there's an emperor. The emperor's family is from the Yamato clan, right? Which is kind of like a big family. Right? So I want to emphasize that. First of all, that Japan is not completely unified in this time period. But there is the beginnings of unification, the beginnings of a state connected to the Yamato clan, from the family from which we get the emperors. So to kind of talk about Japan's connection with China and Korea, Japan is going to benefit from borrowing advanced farming techniques and tools from outside Japan, from China, and to a certain extent Korea. We've already mentioned they're going to be borrowing Buddhism, and that doesn't simply come directly from China. It also will come through Korea. Koreans are very important in establishing Buddhism in Japan. Japan will borrow the Chinese language. Now, there is a Japanese language today, which we'll talk about in another lecture, and a Japanese, or I should say Japanese alphabet, rather, there's always been a Japanese language. But there's a Japanese alphabet today, but their first writing came from Chinese characters. And in fact, the alphabet Japanese people use today is based on Chinese characters anyway. But what's interesting, and this I find fascinating, is that the Japanese are going to borrow Chinese writing and then use it to write a history, their history, asserting how awesome they are. So they take something from China to assert how they are a special, unique people by writing a history about themselves. Actually, they write a couple histories about themselves, talking about how awesome they are. That gives them a sense of identity, just like writing gave Chinese people a sense of identity. It's just it gave Chinese people a sense of Chinese identity and Japanese people a sense of Japanese identity. They will also be borrowing from China, a system of government. Right? Japan will be looking to China to try and imitate their system of government, and they will actually claim to have an emperor. Now, the history is complex, but Koreans mostly just called themselves kings. They didn't try and ever call themselves emperors, not until the late 19th century, because it was believed by China that there was only one emperor, one heavenly superperson in the world, and that one emperor in China was the person who connected heaven and earth. But the Japanese are going to say, well, we have an emperor term, too. They'll use the exact same Chinese term to talk about their emperor. But again, you can see how the Japanese are going to adapt things to fit their own circumstances. So while the Chinese believed in the mandate of heaven, remember they believed that heaven chose the best, most virtuous family to rule China, the best dynasty, the Japanese will say, well, our emperor is different. He rules, the emperor from the Yamato clan, because he is the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So the Japanese borrow the term, but they don't refer much to the mandate of heaven. They refer to this idea that their emperor is the emperor because he's descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So that's kind of interesting, right? They borrow the term, but then they change the meaning somewhat. Also, one thing that they point out is that they would say, we Japanese are so awesome, we never changed dynasties. Our emperor always had the mandate of heaven. And that's, in a sense, true. The Yamato clan, as long as we have history, has ruled or has been the emperors of Japan. So Japan never changed dynasties, right? They always had the same dynasty ruling. And the Japanese said, see, this proves how we're more moral than the Chinese because our emperors never changed. So I think Japan's really cheeky here, right? They take Chinese ideas and then turn them around to say, well, we Japanese are better than you Chinese. Kind of a fascinating idea. But that's what they are going to argue in terms of their emperor. So taking Chinese ideas to assert Japanese identity. The man pictured there on the left is named Prince Shotoku, and he is key in this. And one thing I want to stress, sometimes like with the farming and tools, that just kind of happens naturally. But Prince Shotoku is from the imperial clan, and he wants to make the central government of the Yamato clan of the emperor more powerful, more strong, to make it more like a Chinese government. He wants to strengthen imperial central government under the Yamato emperors to make it more powerful against the local clans. So there's like aristocrats basically in Japan from other clans outside the Yamato family that they want power too. And Shotoku is going to use Chinese ideas to elevate the Japanese emperor so high as he can, right? In order to control those clans. Right? He uses Chinese ideas to say how awesome the Japanese emperor is and how he's much better than any of the Japanese clans, and that's why he's in charge. And this is being done purposefully, right? And that's one reason why Shotoku is going to emphasize Buddhism as well, right? In order to try and form this universal religion around which all Japanese people can be unified. And of course, who's building all the Buddhist temples? Well, it's the Japanese emperor. So we can see once again that idea of using state-sponsored Buddhism to strengthen rule. And this works really well for a time. We'll talk about in another section about how eventually the system kind of falls apart, doesn't last. But it does work. And eventually it works well enough that we still have a Japanese emperor today, descended from the same family. Now, one thing I want to point out, because Japan is farther from China, there's less pressure on them so they can develop more on their own. Especially, it's a big deal to have an ocean between you and China because China doesn't really become a major naval power, at least not for a long time. That's why they can get away with saying that they have an emperor. The Koreans could not have gotten away with that. They would have probably been invaded if they claimed to have an emperor. But Japan can. There wasn't a whole lot China could do about it. But just to give you kind of a visual representation of what I mean about how Japan is copying from China, there is Chang'an, the capital of China, right? Once again, of Tong China. Notice we have those wonderful grid lines there, symmetrical. Palace in the north, emperor facing south. And look at Japan, at Nara, the capital Nara. The Japanese tended to change capitals a lot. In fact, whereas we divide Chinese history by dynasties, we divide Japanese history by where the Japanese state had its capital. So they changed it a lot. But during this time period, they had one of their major capitals was in Nara. And notice Nara is almost symmetrical. There's a mountain here, and that prevented it from being completely symmetrical. But it's almost symmetrical. They've got the palace in the north facing south. They've got these wonderful grid lines, trying to show the harmony and stability that imperial rule was meant to bring. So you can see here again, Japan is borrowing ideas from China, adapting them to their own circumstances in order to elevate the power of the centralized state headed by the emperors.